speeches are the best.
I'm an anti-Zionist, says Christopher Hitchens, who often spoke and wrote of his stance against Israel. I'm one of those people of Jewish descent who believes that Zionism would be a mistake even if there were no Palestinians. So on the surface, atheism and the support for, I guess, the legitimacy of the state of Israel seem like things that wouldn't really go together because there's so much religious Zionism, there's Christian Zionism, which influences American politics in a really bad way. You know, most of the evangelical lobby really do believe in Christian Zionism and basically using Israel as a tool to bring about the end times. So you think most atheists would be against that. Most atheists, you know, rail against the power of the Catholic Church or Christian groups in America. And Christopher Hitchens did used to be a leftist, was a guy that did have, you know, quite weird politics in that he supported the Iraq War. But his old leftist past did kind of inform him. So his stance against Zionism is not surprising. But new atheism, in my opinion, as a whole, is basically Western chauvinism, and it takes away the religious aspect, but it still talks about like the supremacy of the West. And this is so evident in essentially Sam Harris's support for Israel. While he doesn't agree with the justification for founding the Israeli state, he does pretty much agree with the actions of the Israeli state against the Palestinians, who he constantly says are all like Hamas supporters. Israelis never really do much wrong. They actually show a lot of restraint in how they combat Palestinian insurgents and basically likes to link all Palestinians to Islamicism. And I want to talk about this today specifically, and I want to frame it in the context of Israel pink washing their apartheid and their colonialism. And it's probably because recently Israel literally targeted and killed a Palestinian American journalist. I've been bombarded with both Israeli tourism adverts and Tel Aviv pride adverts, and I'm going to show you them a bit later in full because they're trying to basically distract from their recent atrocities, not that they do them like basically every single day on Palestinians, and try and frame Israel as this sea of, you know, progressivism, wokeism in the backwards Middle East. And like a lot of Israeli supporters like to say, Israel's the only place in the Middle East where you can be openly gay or openly LGBT, which I mean is great and everything, but we're going to get into an account of a Palestinian lesbian who kind of was influenced by this propaganda, but then found out that Israelis are happy enough to accept lesbians, not so much if you're a Palestinian. So all of that in the video today, but before we go any further, you guys have been waiting. I finally got the new chocolate orange. Well, actually, the new chocolate orange is there, but you guys have been a bit annoyed about the style of the pyramid. So I think the pyramid's quite nice now. Like, we have white at the bottom, white at the top, red. I think it's a bit more color coordinated. So basically, if you guys don't understand, for every 5k, I get a new chocolate orange. So that is for 75k. We're now on 76 point something k. Help me keep chugging along to get 80k. And then I think we can just have like a big wall of chocolate oranges. I think that'll look pretty cool. And then hopefully one day it just like fills up like the whole background. But also like the video. And for today's comment, let me know, what is the worst thing Sam Harris has said? Or what is the worst, most right-wing thing a new atheist has said that seems to kind of even go against atheism, or new atheists who've basically become apologists for religious groups in the West? Also consider supporting me on Patreon. I want to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and the benefits of that are getting my Nintendo Switch friend code and getting access to the private patrons Discord server. Also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter, on Instagram, and check out my subreddit in the description. Also, check out my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra, where I archive all my live streams. So first, I just want to talk about, I guess, new atheism as a whole and their stance on Israel. Then we'll look at Christopher Hitchens quick, and then we're going to go into detail into Sam Harris's take on Israel. So an article by Stuart McAnullah from the University of Leeds, Gaza and has new atheists split over which religion is more wrong. So we're going to just skip a bit forward because we're going to talk about Sam Harris in a bit. But Richard Dawkins has described the recent destruction in Gaza as obscene, reflecting the widespread anger within the UK at the high Palestinian death toll. Dawkins has also spoken of the problems of raising difficult questions to people from either religious side of the conflict. For example, he argues an emotional taboo can prevent otherwise rational people from confronting questions such as whether the Palestinians are ultimately being made to pay the price for Hitler's crimes against the Jews. Richard Carrier says he is disinclined to believe claims that the Israeli military are not deliberately targeting schools and hospitals in Gaza. He argues there is a difference between responding justly with necessary force to terror and danger and using that as a cover for trying to get away with evils even greater than those achieved by the enemy you're answering. Carrier points to what he calls the Armageddon lobby in America, elements of the Christian right which support Israel as they believe war will eventually erupt in the region to bring upon the end times and the return of Christ. It's the political power of this lobby that has helped provide Israel with a get-out-of-jail-free card for evil it sometimes commits, he says, and I totally agree with that, and also something I've made my own videos on. So Christopher Hitchens was obviously dead by this point, but I just want to show you some of his views on Israel-Palestine before moving on to going into Sam Harris's long-ass explanation about basically why he supports Israel committing every crime under the sun.
On the first, yes, I do, but I think the securely recognized borders should not allow for Israeli colonization or occupation of the territory of its neighbors, which is what it's doing now. The right to exist argument has been used now to the point where what it's going to mean is that the Israel you're talking about will include the annexed and illegally occupied West Bank. So the right to exist argument is going to rebound on those who use it unclearly and who don't say what they mean by Israel. It's very interesting, the Israeli government has never said where it thinks the borders of Israel really ought to be and what it would settle for. I think it would be an immense help if Israel's going to insist on the right to exist, if it tells us where it thinks Israel's boundaries should be. Every other country does do that.
I'd better give you the straight answer. I think Zionism, the idea of building a state of Jewish farmers on Arab land in the Middle East, is a stupid idea to begin with. I've always thought so. My mother wanted to go and be a Zionist immigrant at one point. I tried to talk her out of it. It's been a thing in my family. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a messianic idea. I think it's a superstitious idea. And I think
so the idea of Israel's right to exist is
now that it's there,
has no play with you.
Many states are founded on injustices or foolishness and bad ideas.
And boundaries are drawn by all kinds of political.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that anyone can just come and evict or destroy them. And I'm not saying that, but I think I'd have to say, so as not to seem shady,
yeah.
I've always thought it's a silly, messianic, superstitious nationalist idea, and it's a waste of Judaism. Guaranteed an injustice to the Arabs, which now anyone can see, and is now entering its third, fourth generation. Fourth generation of Palestinians brought up either in exile or dispossession or under occupation and humiliation. And now we know that something has to be done to address what is part of the original, let's not call it original sin, original misconception of the thing. So I've been writing in favor of a Palestinian homeland all my life, and I'm no more, no less in favor of it than I was because of recent events. But it should be a matter of principle. If Jews born in Brooklyn have a right to a state in Palestine, then Palestinians born in Jerusalem have a right to a state in Palestine. Anyone who doesn't agree with that principle, I think, is suspect.
Christopher Hitchens does, of course, have Jewish family, and he's saying that Zionism is a stupid idea. Israel's right to exist is ridiculous. It's not worth defending. And for him, he's talking about creating this Palestinian homeland and how Israel is not defining its borders properly because it basically wants people to think that all of that territory belongs to them. Now, I'm not saying it's like the most scathing criticism of Israel ever, or, you know, someone like me who thinks there should just be one secular Palestinian nation for all the people in the region, including Israelis, and it should be a secular democracy. It's also my take on Ireland as well, because you can't heal scars of colonialism if monuments to colonialism still exist. Although, you know, I'm not naive to think that Israel is going anywhere anytime soon, especially because the US backs every single thing it does. The US and Israel formed alliances with, you know, people who were key in funding opposition to Israel. Most Arab states are now aligned with Israel, despite their populations not liking them. So Christopher Hitchens is probably operating with this understanding that, you know, the best you can kind of hope for is probably a two-state solution. But under, like, Trump and now Biden, even that seems increasingly unlikely at this point. But basically, before we move forward, I think I should inform you guys, maybe if you're not as familiar with Zionism, is that Zionism has many different elements, and a lot of the original founders of Israel weren't actually religious. Some of them were actually atheists. For a lot of the original founders of Israel, people who'd fought in World War II against the Nazis or grown up in occupied Nazi states, what Zionism was for them was for a Jewish homeland. And that Jewish homeland for some of them meant Palestine, but for a lot of them, they didn't really care. Like, a lot of them just wanted a Jewish homeland because they believed the only way to combat anti-Semitism and make sure Jews were safe is if they ruled themselves in their own country. And you already had Palestinian Jews who were fighting an insurgency war against the British Mandate in the 40s to try and create their own state. And starting in about the 1860s, but becoming more mainstream in the 1960s after the Six-Day War, you had religious Zionism, which essentially blended Orthodox Judaism with Zionism, and this has become increasingly popular in Israel over the last few decades. So though the prominent Zionists who colonized Israel in the 1940s a lot of the time didn't care about Judaism at all, it's still fair to say, like Hitchens and the others, saying that creating a state essentially based on religious beliefs is ridiculous. And personally, my big take on Israel and people supporting it is that it's totally gross. You would have supported apartheid South Africa. If you support Israel, you're supporting apartheid, you're supporting colonialism. So by and large, if you are an atheist who supports Israel, you either have to reconcile with yourself, you support some sort of religious justification to colonialism, or you're just a Western chauvinist who believes European Jews colonizing the Middle East and subjugating a population there was actually a good thing. And Sam Harris is the latter. So I'm going to play you some of the clips of this Sam Harris video. I've got a transcript up for me to read, but I'm going to actually just play you the audio of his podcast. So let's first start with Sam Harris's disagreements with Israel.
I don't think Israel should exist as a Jewish state. I think it is obscene, irrational, and unjustifiable to have a state organized around a religion. So I don't celebrate the idea that there's a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. And I certainly don't support any Jewish claims to real estate based on the Bible. Though I just said that I don't think Israel should exist as a Jewish state, the justification for such a state is rather easy to find. We need look no further than the fact that the rest of the world has shown itself eager to murder the Jews at almost every opportunity. So if there were going to be a state organized around protecting the members of a single religion, it certainly should be a Jewish state. Now, friends of Israel might consider this a rather tepid defense, but it's the strongest one I've got. I think the idea of a religious state is ultimately untenable. Needless to say, in defending its territory as a Jewish state, the Israeli government and Israelis themselves have had to do terrible things. They have, as they are now, fought wars against the Palestinians that have caused massive losses of innocent life. More civilians have been killed in Gaza in the last few weeks than militants. Now that's not a surprise, given that Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on earth. Occupying it, fighting wars in it, is guaranteed to get women and children and other non-combatants killed. And there's probably little question over the course of fighting multiple wars that the Israelis have done things that amount to war crimes. They have been brutalized by this process, that is, made brutal by it. But that is largely due to the character of their enemies.
So Sam Harris disagrees with the foundation of Israel pretty much. He does agree with the argument that if any minority group deserves their own country to rule themselves, it is the Jews, but fundamentally he doesn't agree with a state based on religion. But then he ends this little bit by saying that while the Israelis have done war crimes and fought wars against Arabs and the Palestinians, they've also been brutalized by the process. And you can already see where he's starting to downplay all the bad things Israel does. And now let's get into him starting to defend Israeli war crimes.
Whatever terrible things the Israelis have done, it is also true to say that they have used more restraint in their fighting against the Palestinians than we, the Americans and the Europeans, have used in any of our wars. They have endured more worldwide public scrutiny than any society has ever had to while defending itself against aggressors. The Israelis simply are held to a different standard. And the condemnation leveled at them by the rest of the world is completely out of proportion to what they've actually done. It is clear that Israel is losing the PR war and has been for years now. One of the most galling things for outside observers about the current war in Gaza is the disproportionate loss of life on the Palestinian side. This doesn't make a lot of moral sense. Israel built bomb shelters to protect its citizens. The Palestinians built tunnels through which they could carry out terror attacks and kidnap Israelis. Should Israel be blamed for successfully protecting its population in a defensive war? I don't think so.
So Sam Harris is obviously not a historian, and it constantly comes across to me that he doesn't really know history that well, despite using it a lot in justifications for his arguments. So the belief that Israelis use restraint in their fighting is absolutely laughable. So Sam Harris makes obviously the good point that, yeah, Western Europeans and Americans aren't really restrained when it comes to fighting themselves, right? Israelis are no different. They don't care at all. So the 6-Day War is a perfect example. They, of course, attacked an American NSA ship. They pretended they thought it was an Egyptian ship. And then later they also bombed refugee camps and buses carrying Palestinian refugees to British Red Cross refugee camps. Israel, when it fights these wars, is absolutely out of control, and they don't care because they know they can get away with it. Even more so today. In 1967, they didn't have the full backing of the United States. They had the full backing of Britain and France. But after 1967, they did have the full backing of the US. Because of the war in Vietnam, they wanted to rely on another partner in the Middle East to help them. So they've only gotten more blatant. Think of what they did to Gaza last year. They didn't care. You can literally watch cell phone footage from Palestinians suffering from the bombardment, and everyone can see that on Twitter. So many celebrities came out and criticised them in a way I hadn't seen before. Israeli government does not care because the UN cannot do anything against them because of their allies, mainly the US, allowing them to get away with everything. The Israelis know this, and that's why they often show absolutely no restraint. And that's why they kill a really famous Palestinian American journalist and just don't care and act like nothing's happened and then pump your social media feeds full of pinkwashing. And also I love the notion that Palestinians and Israelis had the same resources. So Sam Harris says that Israelis build bomb shelters, Palestinians build tunnels to attack Israel, right? Let's just take this as they are both independent states having a fight, right? Israel clearly has so much more capital, has so much investment from Western companies and Western corporations, has their defense funded by the United States government. They have so much money to spend on war. Gaza is literally one of the most poor places in the Middle East. They can't even access clean water. Most people are unemployed. You think they're going to have the money to build loads of great bomb shelters? And also, they're under occupation. Yeah, Hamas are absolutely anti-Semitic Islamic fundamentalists. I don't support their ideology, but also the reason they even exist in the first place, apart from the Israeli intelligence funding them to divide Palestinians against each other, the secular and the Islamist Palestinians, it's because they are resisting oppression. That's why people support them. That's why even Palestinian Christians voted for them, because they seem like the only militant group willing to stand up to the Israelis. So as an insurgent group fighting like an apartheid system and being stuck in an open-air prison, I'm not very surprised they're building tunnels to fight the Israelis. But let's go on a bit further. It actually gets a lot worse.
What would the Jews do to the Palestinians if they could do anything they wanted? Well, we know the answer to that question, because they can do more or less anything they want. The Israeli army could kill everyone in Gaza tomorrow. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when they drop a bomb on a beach and kill 4 Palestinian children, as happened last week, this is almost certainly an accident. They're not targeting children. They could target as many children as they want. Every time a Palestinian child dies, Israel edges ever closer to becoming an international pariah. So the Israelis take great pains not to kill children and other non-combatants. Now, is it possible that some Israeli soldiers go berserk under pressure and wind up shooting into crowds of rock-throwing children? Of course. You will always find some soldiers acting this way in the middle of a war. But we know that this isn't the general intent of Israel. We know that Israelis do not want to kill non-combatants, because they could kill as many as they want, and they're not doing it. What do we know of the Palestinians? What would the Palestinians do to the Jews in Israel if the power imbalance were reversed? Well, they have told us what they would do. For some reason, Israel's critics just don't want to believe the worst about a group like Hamas, even when it declares the worst of itself. We've already had a Holocaust and several other genocides in the 20th century. People are capable of committing genocide. When they tell us they intend to commit genocide, we should listen. There is every reason to believe that the Palestinians would kill all the Jews in Israel if they could. Would every Palestinian support genocide? Of course not. But vast numbers of them, and of Muslims throughout the world, would. Needless to say, Palestinians in general, and not just Hamas, have a history of targeting innocent non-combatants in the most shocking ways possible. They've blown themselves up on buses and in restaurants. They've massacred teenagers. They've murdered Olympic athletes. They now shoot rockets indiscriminately into civilian areas.
So I find this like so gross. So basically his answer is, every time Israel kills Palestinian civilians, it didn't mean it, because every time it does that, it gets closer to being an international pariah. Does it though? It doesn't. We all know the US will back them no matter what. The same way the US will always put sanctions on Cuba for politics. Because the Christian right is so powerful in America, they dominate politics and they dominate the conversation on Israel. So they want politicians to pledge massive support, unquestioning support to Israel no matter what. And if you have the US's backing, like Saudi Arabia, you can do whatever you want. Even if every other single country in the world hated Israel, it wouldn't matter, because the US backs them completely. And then you obviously, which I think is a bit overblown, I think the Christian right have more influence than the Israeli lobby. You also have the Israeli lobby in America, which pressure, I think, mainly Democratic politicians to support anything Israel does. So there you have the Israeli lobby mainly influencing the Democrats, the Christian right and Christian Zionists influencing the Republicans, and you have the most powerful nation in history backing everything Israel does. The US just acted like it was normal after the IDF killed a journalist. And he's also saying that because Palestinians have done like suicide bombings and terror attacks, that means they want to kill all Jewish people far more than the Israelis want to kill all Palestinians. Also, I think Sam Harris has to understand how many people in Israel view Palestinians as subhuman and would actually like to kill all of them. Here's actually a clip from Abby Martin interviewing some Israelis about what they think they should do with people in Gaza.
I don't think there's any answer to it.
Really?
There's only one way, like, I would carpet bomb them.
You would carpet bomb them?
It's the only way you could deal with it. Like, or try to stop them a different way. It never worked.
You mean all Arabs or Gaza or?
I believe that they, like, I hope to believe they're not, but I do think they are, because I don't trust them. You can't trust them, and that's the only way I believe that. The only way is just to stop it completely.
So in that Israeli's mind there, the only way to stop the violence on the Palestinian side is kill them all. I thought Sam Harris told me that no one in Israel would ever say such a thing. He's just your average guy, looks like a guy you'd see down the street, saying that you should do a genocide against all Palestinians. So in one way I take Sam Harris's point that yes, extremist groups do hate Jewish people, but it's not just relegated to Hamas, that's lots of Islamic extremist groups. But I also completely reject that Israelis don't, as a matter of policy, target Palestinian civilians, and there isn't an element within Israel who would happily kill them all. And also another thing I want to say as well. So let's say Israelis don't want to kill Palestinians, they just want to keep them locked up in Gaza and take away their land, keep evicting them from their homes, keep doing ethnic cleansing, but they don't want to kill them all. But all Palestinians would happily kill all Israelis if they could take over Israel, right? He says that they want to do this primarily because of Islam. The reason they want to kill all the Jews is because of Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic beliefs, completely omitting that most of these people have been evicted from their homes, brutalized, killed, had their family members killed. Here's two examples for you, right? So the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, killed loads of Czech people, brutalized loads of Czech people, killed loads of Czech communists, right? You brutalize a population so bad that you radicalize that population against their oppressors. What did the Czechs do once the war was over? They nearly kicked out every single German person from Czechoslovakia. That's obviously not right. Ethnic cleansing is wrong. They killed a lot of people too. But also, is this inevitable when you keep people under such brutal occupation that the large-scale reaction of the masses is going to be something very terrible? If you literally put people under genocidal ethnic cleansing regimes, you can't be surprised that when the power shifts, they don't want to treat you fairly. The same thing happened in Haiti, of course, as well, because Haitians lived under a system of slavery where they weren't even seen as human, they were seen as property. Once they rose up, probably wasn't surprising they targeted the whole of society. I'm not even saying Palestinians would even do this, but when you have a system of oppression that is so brutal, if people become extremely radicalized that they will join groups like Hamas and blow themselves up, That is a symptom of the oppression, not that these people are all deranged by Islam, in that Islam is making them kill Jewish people. You literally can remove religion pretty much from the equation, in that there's always been Palestinian insurgent groups, secular ones that didn't do it for Islam, and there's always been Israelis who didn't believe in Judaism. It was the same in Northern Ireland, it was the same in Ireland. Lots of people don't actually even believe in religion. And lots of people in Northern Ireland aren't really Catholic or aren't really Protestant. They just believe in the identities attached to them. The same way a lot of Palestinians identify as Palestinian, not Muslim. The same way a lot of Israelis identify as Israeli or ethnically Jewish, but don't actually believe in the religion. So unless you're an atheist who believes every single problem in the world is caused by religion, you would see the conflict in this regard. Not blame the Palestinians for their own oppression because they have some Islamic extremists, and you guys think Islam is the source of all the world's problems.
And again, you have to ask yourself, what do these groups want? What would they accomplish if they could accomplish anything? What would the Israelis do if they could do what they want? They would live in peace with their neighbors, if they had neighbors who would live in peace with them. They would simply continue to build out their high-tech sector and thrive. What do groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and even Hamas want? They want to impose their religious views on the rest of humanity. They want to stifle every freedom that decent and educated and secular people care about. This is not a trivial difference. And yet, judging from the level of condemnation that Israel now receives, you would think the difference ran the other way. This kind of confusion puts us all in danger. This is the great story of our time. For the rest of our lives, and the lives of our children, we're going to be confronted by people who don't want to live peacefully in a secular, pluralistic world, because they are desperate to get to paradise, and they're willing to destroy the very possibility of human happiness along the way. The truth is, we are all living in Israel. It's just that some of us haven't realized it yet.
So it's clear Sam Harris fundamentally does not understand any of the issues of Israel-Palestine. So apparently, if you leave Israel to their own devices, they'll just live peacefully. Israel beat all the hostile Arab countries in multiple wars. Most of them are now friendly to Israel. Israel has somewhat good relations with loads of Arab countries now. They're not under threat of invasion, but they constantly keep expanding their territory. Why do they keep expanding their territory if they can relatively live in peace now? Why do they start taking parts of Syria to make parts of Israel if we're just talking about, I don't know, a conflict with Gaza? And then he links Hamas with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and he makes it about religion. So Israel just want to live in peace. And that's why Israel colonized Palestine and made it an apartheid state, because they want to live in peace. That's why the government keep backing the settlers to evict more Palestinians from their home, because they just want to live in peace. It's this Western chauvinism brain rot, framed as some sort of atheism, which is just so hard to understand, but shows you how fundamentally stupid people like Sam Harris are, because Israel-Palestine is like Northern Ireland. It's like the British colonization of the Republic of Ireland. It's like apartheid South Africa. It's colonialism first and foremost. The religious stuff takes a back seat. It's important, yes, but primarily it's an apartheid state fighting an oppressed group. And when the group fight back, people often cry, well, they're savages, they're terrorists. The IRA, even the original ones, which my family were in back in the 1910s, when you start fighting back against like 800 years of apartheid, subjugation and genocide, because you've killed a couple civilians once, they're like, you're the terrorist. But when hundreds of thousands have been killed over decades and centuries, that's not a problem apparently, because you've done it as part of the government. It's clear Sam Harris is clearly on the side of apartheid and ethnic cleansing if you frame the conflict in this way. Now, this is in 2014. Surely Sam Harris has changed? Nope. Back when Gaza was being bombed again last year, he basically tweeted out this podcast saying his views hadn't changed. But it plays into a broader issue with New Atheism and also just Western chauvinism, is that Israel is also good because it's not backwards like Islam. It's not backward like Muslims. They have LGBT rights. They have more women's equality. Women can serve in the IDF. I made a whole video about how Israel often use this for their propaganda. But today I want to focus more on the progressivism and the LGBT rights. But Sam Harris has spoke to a lot of people who believe the West is killing itself because it's accepting Muslim refugees. This deeply xenophobic and racist ideology pushed by Sam Harris, people like Douglas Murray, in that when you import, illiberal Muslims, then one day we're going to wake up and we're not going to recognize the West anymore, despite the fact Poland and Hungary have weaponized these refugees coming here to actually create essentially fascist governments. Who's the illiberal people now? Is it the fascist governments of Hungary and Poland? Or is it poor Syrian refugees looking for shelter and food and a job in a Western country? And like I said, recently Israel's been in a lot of conflict. So I have been getting these adverts on YouTube non-stop. So let's first take a look at this one. It's from Visit Israel, 55k subscribers, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Book your trip now. So 40 seconds, let's watch.
Hey yo!
We want to introduce you to the most amazing destinations in the world.
Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's young,
Sunny,
colorful,
diverse. It's balagan, messy, and above all,
it's incredibly tasty.
Tel Aviv beaches are the best.
Tel Aviv and Jerusalem have the most amazing nightlife.
Jerusalem, the heart of the world, where all people come together. A spiritual adventure with 3,000 years of amazing history. See you here soon.
We love you. Tel Aviv, Jerusalem.
Book your trip now.
So it feels really dystopian that an apartheid state that is currently doing ethnic cleansing and apartheid is telling me to come to one of their beaches, which is probably built on a Palestinian mass grave from 1948. But yeah, can you see how this advert is kind of trying to play into the woke crowd? Notice also you don't see any non-white people in that clip either, despite Israel being pretty diverse itself. They try and make it seem like a European country. Here's two people who look very European. Look, the girl with the rainbow hair doing crazy dance moves. Again, how much they sanitize what they're doing right now honestly is so disgusting to me. But again, it's for image cultivation. For people like Sam Harris, look at Israel. Look how free we are. We can wear bikinis. We can wear short shorts. We can dance around and go to nightclubs. And we can be who we want to be. Tel Aviv pride and stuff like that. And then Sam Harris sees that and he's like, oh yes, that's worth defending. Defend the apartheid state. Not like Gaza with those Hamas types, because they're just organic and spring out of nowhere. Not that they're a reaction to decades of apartheid and genocide. Here's another one. This has been well documented. Israeli pinkwashing. Basically using Israel's more progressive stance on LGBT rights compared to a lot of Middle Eastern countries. Basically say, well, our apartheid is justified because those backward Muslims don't accept LGBT people, so we must create this state in the Middle East where they're accepted. Hey people, haven't you always dreamed of going to a Tel Aviv beach and kissing your boyfriend on a Palestinian mass grave, or a state that is built on evicting people from their homes and killing them? So obviously this stuff isn't aimed at leftists like me because we see through this propaganda, but to a lot of liberals this is quite a convincing argument, because you will show them, well, look at Saudi Arabia where you get killed for being gay. Look at all these Middle Eastern countries where you might be killed by a mob if you're gay, or you might be sent to prison if you're gay, or you might be blacklisted from every job if it's found out that you're gay. And to them, they see Israel and they don't really maybe understand the conflict enough, or they don't really think Israel is like this apartheid state, and they think, well, that's a good thing because the Middle East is so backwards that this one country, which is more European because a lot of the settlers were European, does actually have a good stance on LGBT rights, and if you're gay, you can go live in Israel freely, and isn't that great? And yes, that is good for gay Israelis. I'm happy for you LGBT Israelis. I know you can't actually get married there. That's something Israel often leave out. I'm happy there is less of a risk of you being attacked for being yourself in Israel. At the same time, I don't think this justifies your ongoing apartheid and ethnic cleansing. and I don't think it also justifies Israel's right to exist as a nation state. Now, of course, being gay in Israel is easier than being gay in Palestine, so I wanted to share you a personal story of a lesbian Palestinian who was kind of influenced by this propaganda and then went to a Tel Aviv university. And I'll let the article speak for itself. So, Cole, a journal for body and gender research, summer 2015, Pinkwashing Israel's International Strategy and Internal Agenda by Gadir Shafi. One of the techniques Israel uses in its pinkwashing campaigns is to fabricate myths about saving Palestinian queers from their homophobic and oppressive families and communities by bringing them to live in Tel Aviv, the ultimate gay haven. Tel Aviv may be a gay heaven for Jewish Israeli citizens or even for the hundreds of visitors who engage in gay tourism. However, it's neither friendly nor a haven for Palestinian LGBTs and queers. As a teenager questioning my sexuality, I felt completely estranged and alone. Conversations about sexuality were non-existent, and even among professionals working within schools. While school counsellors and psychologists addressed controversial issues related to early marriage, domestic and street violence, and the abuse of dogs among teenagers, they refrained from addressing issues related to sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Even gay literature in Arabic was rare, so I mostly read in Hebrew. Learning about sexual orientation and gender identity in a foreign language was itself alienating. The only means of communication available to me was a support line operated by an Israeli organisation. After much debate, I called the line, and the voice on the other end urged me to move to Tel Aviv. There he assured me I would live my life freely as a lesbian. It was the first time anyone described me as such, even before I was able to define my own sexuality. Despite this disconcerting drawback, the thought of moving to Tel Aviv accompanied me for my last years of school, and shortly after graduating, I applied to study at Tel Aviv University. The move to Tel Aviv was overwhelming. There I thought I would explore my sexuality and live freely, without having to hide, to be closeted, to cease to exist in so many ways. I was introduced to early 90s gay life in Tel Aviv for its vibrant bars and late-night gay parties, and made many gay Israeli friends. It didn't take long to realise that they were friendly to me as a lesbian while constantly trying to conceal, even suppress, my Palestinian identity. They affirmed that I did not look and sound Arab, so there was no need for me to embarrass them by bringing up my Palestinianness in conversations with others. I protested that my name clearly showed I was Arab. That was when they proposed changing my name for me. I went home feeling disgusted at the thought of being renamed by colonial oppressors to better fit their definition of the lesbian category of identity and not offend their racial sensibilities. I had been a Palestinian Arab my entire life who simply happened to question their sexuality. I had come to Tel Aviv to be who I was, but it became clear to me I was welcome there as a lesbian, not a Palestinian. In their world of alleged freedoms and rights, there was no place for my Palestinianness. I had to choose between being gay and being Palestinian, but giving up a part of myself was impossible to bear. I had never experienced such rejection, and the thought of its exclusion made me sick of the Israeli LGBT scene. At the end of my first year of university, I packed all my stuff, left Tel Aviv without saying my farewells, determined never to go back. So I think that sums it up nicely in that personal story, that in Israel, it is easier to be part of the LGBT community than be a Palestinian. And being a lesbian Palestinian, well, they don't care about the lesbian part, but it would be nice if maybe you shut up about being a Palestinian or an Arab. And it makes me laugh the irony of Israel framing itself as a very tolerant and open society while treating one group of people like absolute garbage, allowing far-right settlers to evict them from their homes, allowing Americans to come over and steal homes from Palestinians, while some Palestinians in Israel talk about bombing the whole of Gaza and killing every single Palestinian because they fight back against their own oppression. And because of general racism against Arabs and Muslims in the West, people maybe don't even find that shocking, and like Sam Harris, they blame the Palestinians. Would you blame Catholic protesters in Northern Ireland between the 60s and the 90s for what was happening to them? Would you blame the IRA for what the British had done to Ireland for the last 800 years of history? You wouldn't blame them. You would see the IRA as a reaction to colonialism. Even if you hate the IRA, even if you disagree with all their methods, you can see they didn't spring up out of nowhere. They didn't just one day manifest into being because they hated England for no reason. They're obviously a militant reaction to colonialism. Hamas is completely different in that I completely hate their ideology and politics, but at the same time, it's still created as a reaction to colonialism and oppression, the same way the PLO were created in this way. So people like Sam Harris play into this pink washing, this woke washing, that Palestinians are backwards and use suicide bombings and everything like that because they are Islamic savages. Essentially, Israel's like this enlightened European Western style democracy, and they use so much restraint because if they wanted to, they could kill every Palestinian, but they don't because they don't want to become a pariah. Doesn't understand the history, has no compassion for the Palestinians, just views the whole world in his ridiculous new atheist point of view where everything is about religion and nothing is about colonialism or oppression. So that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Follow me on social media, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.